Hey everyone, welcome to The Seven Eighths, a podcast to share stories on failures and rejections. There may not be any fairy tale endings in this podcast. My guests aren't past the mountain of struggle. In fact, some of them might still be in it. I hope this podcast serves as a forum for friends and acquaintances to exchange tales of defeat. Defeat that make the 7/8 part of our lives. You know, like the part of the iceberg that you can see. By sharing these stories, I hope we can all normalize failures and hence win over that fear of defeat. Because failing is just a part of living. I hope you will relate. Do leave me a note of feedback, and critique is welcome as well. You can find me on Twitter at FemNectar. Now, on to our episode. This episode marks the 1-year anniversary of the 7/8ths. I want to thank everyone involved in helping me get to this milestone, starting from my family, my close friends, guests that have agreed to candidly and authentically share their story, Corey Quinn for giving me the push to keep my work going, and Chris and his entire team from Humble Pod. I owe it to every one of you. I believe, even more than I did a year ago, that we indeed need to talk to help to normalize failures. We absolutely must talk about the 7/8ths part of our life that is submerged beneath the social media persona of each one of us. Thank you for walking with me to this milestone. Thank you for listening to the 7/8ths. Now to our episode. Welcome to episode 16 of the 7/8ths. For this episode, I sat down with Shiva Rajaraman for a conversation about his journey and his struggles. Shiva is no stranger to many of us in the Valley. Shiva Rajaraman has held product leadership roles over the past 2 decades, working on platforms that democratized access for creators. He is currently the VP of Commerce at Facebook, helping people discover products and businesses they love. Previously, he helmed technology for WeWork, helping over 500,000 members find the right space for their working needs so they could fully focus on their business. Prior to this, Shiva held product leadership positions at Spotify, Google, and YouTube. I speak out of personal experience when I say this. Shiva is most excited by helping everyone reach their full creative and business potential, irrespective of their starting point. As you listen to this episode, you will hear Shiva talk about the crazy year of 2020, his personal struggles, and his growth. He candidly shares about the pitfalls of having a wide scope without a narrow focus, his lessons he learned on betting on just people and not looking at culture and purpose. He also talks about the roller coaster ride of scaling a large team and quickly having to pivot, and how he would redo it, if at all. You would hear his eternal optimism, and it is infectious. It's time for just pulling up a chair and listening in. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I want to thank you for agreeing to come on the 7/8ths and actually talk about failures.
Mm-hmm.
It's been interesting having this conversation with a variety of my other guests too.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed is no matter what we see in the media, no matter what we see in social media platforms, everybody has their own journey that is rift with struggles, with rejections that we don't get to see and hear about at all. And it does take courage in cases where, talking about it actually gives you PTSD. And, a certain level of authenticity to come back and come out to the open and say, I failed and it wasn't easy. So I want to say thank you for agreeing to be on the 7/8ths.
Yeah. No, my pleasure. It's definitely, look, we've gone through a crazy year, right? And so I think it's only right that we have a few cathartic moments, like reflecting on, bad decisions, bad outcomes, right? Or just choices. And for me personally, it's kind of been an always on type of situation for several years. So what was really nice about this last year was the time to reflect. And accordingly, I'm excited to talk to you because I do have had time to reflect on those failures.
So I got you in the right moment.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, always want to get people in a state of Zen where they've reflected on it, contemplated, looked ahead at their life. That's impossible. But I am very excited to talk about, things that I thought to think about, especially, we were both at WeWork, right? I came out of WeWork and I took some time off. And that was a very important chapter for me to reflect on what's important and where had I gone wrong by not necessarily prioritizing correctly what I thought was important. I'd find other things and justify something that I felt was very important in the past and was probably key to my success in the past too. And I downrank that as I made choices. And that's one of the biggest things with failure is the worst failures are when you look in the mirror, you fail, and you anticipated the choices when you made those choices that you might actually fail, and yet you still ignored them. So I definitely felt like that as I was reflecting on my past.
I mean, for what it's worth, I wouldn't say that you had failed, but it's interesting to hear that kind of reflection coming from you.
I think a lot of us too are wired to make the best out of anything. And so I generally am an optimist and I like looking at the world around me. And if I made a choice that might have been a bad choice, but I jump into something, I still want to make it work. I want to make the most out of it. So optically, I think a lot of people might not see that as a failure, and that's fine. But internally, there's always a little bit of hey, did I make this choice correctly, right? Did I cheat myself a little bit, or did I have hubris about it and that didn't pan out? And so I had to go through a lot of that over this past summer and just make sure I'd done the right thing.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because there are two kinds of people. So satisficers are people that, as the name goes, that hey, did I check box? Did I hit the milestone, right? And then maximizers are, did I get the maximum that I can out of that experience, out of that opportunity, etc. You strike me as a maximizer.
Yeah, I definitely tend to look at the world that way. But, again, let me make this real. It's almost everything in my career, I feel like I owe to the people I've worked with. And I don't mean that just as a gesture to them. I mean, I've worked in some industries that on surface are just not that exciting, like data integration and, ETL software and business analytics, right? For many people, especially at that era, this is the same time that, Google is born and a lot of consumer stuff is a revolution happening. And I was working in these companies. During that stage, I didn't even have FOMO about those other opportunities because the people I worked with, they were betting on me before I was ready, right? They were coaching me. They were giving me support. They were teaching me a lot of skills that, I take for granted now, but I really am grateful to them, right? Like public speaking or product marketing or really architectural design and things like that at a deep systems level. They really coached me on that. So there's something also about drier perceptually jobs where maybe no one's heard of the logo. If they can attract great people, then the people end up being the thing that keeps you there and keeps you motivated. So one thread that I've always pulled from them is to always take positions based on the people I'm going to work with and who I can learn from and who I can teach and make sure it's a good environment for me. And I don't want to make it sound necessarily you could see this completely going into WeWork and stepping back and saying, oh, I mean, there's a ton of great people there, etc. Right? But there's also certain aspects of that environment that were really rough, right? And I could see some of that before joining. But the purpose was so exciting, put aside those issues, and I had a hubris going into it too. Well, I can help change and improve that stuff. And sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. And so when I reflect on, when you talk about success or failure, was that the right environment for me to succeed? Well, we ended up building a great team. You were there too. And great people motivated around a great, fantastic mission. But there were times where we'd all wake up and look around and say, what's going on? It would have been really interesting to step back and say, what do I care about the people I work with? What are the practices in a company? And what do I need to be successful? and make sure I'm loyal to that. That way, when the bumps come later, you anticipate them and you're ready for them, but you're not caught off guard. And so that for me was like a very important learning.
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually going to take us back from
Okay.
WeWork. And I'm curious about your journey. Did you grow up here in the US?
Primarily. So I was born in India, in Chennai or Madras at the time. Came over, my parents immigrated over, and at that time I was the only child, but we basically bounced around. Jersey had crime back then, as you can imagine. They moved to West Virginia that had heroin going on all the time. You moved to Ohio and different things. And I'm not saying they were always social. They found friends, they found homes, and they found people who really cared for them. But they jumped around everywhere. My sister was born in West Virginia, but together we both went down and we were in Galveston, Texas, which is an island off the coast of Texas. So that's where I grew up, and it's laid back relative to the mainland, so to speak. So Galveston had its own little culture, but fairly isolated, small community, pretty diverse, but also a big split between the educated and the poor, right, in many ways, and a lot of poverty in that town. So growing up in that environment, I think kept me down to earth, to be honest. But I also feel lucky because, this wasn't like the best schools. My parents were obviously educated, so I had an advantage. But when you put it all together, feel like really loyal to my hometown, but also in many ways feel like, wow, I'm lucky. I mean, in today's competitive environment, would I have landed where I did? That's always in the back of my mind. And so every decision I make now, that's why the weight of like thinking through this, did I make the right decision? Should I second guess it? Am I really going to be happy? Am I doing the things that play to my strengths? And that's always top of mind for me in anything I do.
Yeah. And after Galveston, did you end up in the Bay Area right after that?
So I ended up going to school at Berkeley. And so ultimately, Berkeley for me was everything that in some ways was the opposite.
What were your struggles as you transitioned from Galveston to Berkeley?
I mean, the fundamental struggles were, well, one was just, I think I had to develop like a lot more discipline, about like how I spent my time. And when you're in a public state school, like you got to keep up. It's a totally different thing. So one of the transitions was, wow, this is a bar. There are curves. Like you really have to focus and think about achievement in a very different way. Put another way, you've got to fight for it, right? Versus take advantage of your privileged entitlement of having really educated parents. And so that shift was really important for me. And again, I think something I needed. Then the other aspect of it was actually, I just made a lot of friends early on and people I still stay in touch with today from very diverse backgrounds.
I ask you that because usually our impressions of failures, what we perceive as failures, and how we will react to failures get formed typically in those college days.
Maybe to really reflect on this is that when I got there, I majored in molecular biology. It's a pretty hard field and it's like challenging, etc. If I could go back in time, though, I would have taken advantage of that diverse curriculum at Berkeley a lot more. But because of the academic intensity, like it was really hard to have any fluff around that, which I personally regret. Like it's one of these things where now I'm game to try anything now, any new sport, right? Any new whatever you can jump on, like crazy bikes or whatever. And so, but at the time, I think it was more of like, let me get through this, let me get the grades. But I also did not know what I wanted to do next. So I think there would have been a much broader like aperture I could have brought to that experience and what I ended up doing.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't know what you wanted to do next?
Not at all. I was basically on the med school track. Okay. Like I took the MCAT, I got good scores and I was just like, I just did not think through options. A lot of my time, like at that point, like I really thought about the next day growing up and I thought about the next day in school, but I did not think about the next 5 years. And even to this day, I get excited about the next day or I'm not excited about the next day. I don't really have a long-term horizon in the way I look at the world. And I don't know if that's like a failure as much as let's see what tomorrow brings, right? Like it's
It's
like,
reassuring if you ask me.
yeah. So I've never planned out in future, but at that point, I was like, okay, let me punt this decision to go to med school, literally till the day before I need to apply to med school. Right? And so, and I chose not to be honest. And I, had a lot of bumps after that, like, because I just really did not have a plan at all.
Let's talk about those bumps.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost is it ended up obviously panning out really well, but I moved, so graduate, move back to Galveston and and then move in with a buddy in Houston. And he had a job and was working on some cool stuff, but nothing that was a fit for me either, just to be clear. Fast forward a little bit, he does get me my first job in technology, and I'm very grateful to that individual. But I just really didn't know what I was doing. So, I mean, like, just to be clear, like, again, every day is a new day. There was a job I took, which was the craziest thing, which is like, I'm just like, look, I just need to get paid for a while so I can hang out with friends and figure something out. So someone approached me. I mean, this is so crazy at the time too. Like, remember, this is 1995, right? And so, but the internet was not in full form and explosive. Like, there's no like super awesome job sites or something like that. But I remember going to some cafe, seeing some flyer. I was like, oh, I'll try that. And this person pitches me to basically go or on the street, like selling beauty products to people. And they wanted to break into people with people who have darker complexions. They're like, hey, you might be a good fit for this. In that time, this is the 90s, and the Houston Rockets were very good. So that same day was like when they're entering like a championship series or something. I think that happens like in the summertime accordingly, right? And so I remember just one day of work. So I show up, they give me like lipstick and all the stuff to wear around my neck. And I'm walking the streets outside of, where the Rockets play in Houston, just approaching random people and saying, have you tried this lipstick? They're all into this championship game or series that's going on. So it was the most awkward thing. I lasted 24 hours. It was very humbling. I got close to, I don't know, 1,000 rejections in like, 6 hours, right? And I just went home, like, okay, I'm not done. I didn't even show up at the office again. I just did not show up. So that was bumpy, but humbling. And again, it's just like one of these things, which was like, what was I thinking, right? But that's where I was. And I knew it was just like playtime for the summer. So I don't want to sound like this would be my career or something. But that's how I was approaching things at that point. And then at the end of the summer, I was like, I really need to do something. Okay. And so had, some colleagues, uncle, cousins had gone to the University of Illinois. There was an opportunity to do an internship. And that internship was effectively in the molecular biology meets computational like efforts, right, at that point. And this is at the Beckman Institute at UIUC. So I end up, finagling my way into something there. And that was really my first exposure, I would say, to like getting really fascinated about something. Because what we were doing was taking the world's supercomputing that was there, resources. This is effective the National Center of Supercomputing applications. Mark Andreessen and Netscape had been born right in those halls, and they had a multidisciplinary institute where you had biology, distributed computing, right, like real kind of advanced science, material science, and all kinds of stuff all in one building. So now I come in, I'm the most junior person, probably the least skilled person in that entire building as well. But what they ended up saying was like, hey, let's help get this stuff on the internet. And so that was really exciting for me. And I went deep and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah. Where did you go next?
So next I moved to Chicago for a year and was basically, so I really got excited about this analytical side of things. And so I was just basically working for like analyzing a bunch of data for insurance, but it was really a chance to live in Chicago. And so lived in Chicago for a year. I had my first winter and it was rough. Then I moved back out west. My friend that I told you about earlier had joined a company called MicroStrategy, which was like a really interesting analytics thing. They're famous for Bitcoin now. Their founders basically turned the company into a Bitcoin fund, from what I can tell. But at the time, They were a rocket ship and really doing well. And I joined effectively as, basically someone building out solutions and really getting my hands dirty technically, which is really fun.
So then from MicroStrategy, was it then Spotify and Apple?
No, MicroStrategy was a longer road. Again, like I said, a bunch of dry companies superficially, but sort of well-known ones. MicroStrategy, Informatica, and this was in the data integration space. But here is where the magic happened, because in those companies, I really had great managers. And, particularly the CMO at the time just really also gave me opportunities. And that's where I was like thrust into public speaking and doing product marketing efforts, and really came into a product role for the first time, like everything from product requirements to launches to storytelling to press, thrust into that after largely being behind the scenes for most of my career. So that was like that was truly 2 years where skills that I didn't even know I had were thrust at a high bar, and I really thrived in that environment. You know, Fast forward, I ended up going to business school at that point. And this was sort of interesting because working in that space in technology, I was love the people, like I said, not really motivated by the problems. But again, this goes back to like one of my key learnings is people over product for the most part, right? If you're learning, etc. Unless you're starting your own thing and you better be in love with the product. So then I went to business school, and the idea of business school actually was that I was going to leave software and try to go back to these biology roots. So I ended up doing a consulting internship, and my client was Genentech. Like I purposely picked an office where I could do something in biotech.
What were, I mean, of all the movements that you've had, what would you say was the most difficult setback for you?
Well, first and foremost was graduating and going to Houston. Like, as much as I knew that, again, this eternal optimist helps you in some ways, but if every week turns into the same week and you don't see like a horizon, that for me was pretty tough. Like, I think grown up, a lot of activity as a kid, a lot of friends as a kid, go to college, really challenged every day, make a lot of friends, really like enjoy the environment. And then to go to something that was monotonous, and I felt like it was actually of my own creation because I had not like pushed myself to get something that I really felt passionate about at that time. And that's where like a lot of this like living day to day versus being conscious about what's going to happen down the future really hit me at that point, which is like, what am I doing? And I know a lot of people in the world end up in these points where they're like in a rut. For me, that happening like right after graduation was a really low point because, it's also like coming of age in some ways. Like the two collide, and it's your destiny at this point, right? You're an adult and you make these choices. And the choice I made was effectively landing me and peddling beauty products outside of the Houston stadium. And not that that's a bad thing. And it was also like, I think what was really hard about that point is like, I did well in school, I did well in like the MCAT. And so why was I like pretending to be on this journey for med school when I could have just been exploring a lot more and finding something that I did love, right? So I got lucky because, again, this internship kind of introduced me to something that I fell in love with, both conceptually and the job itself and the outcome of the job. But for that, summer specifically, I would say it's like, wow, my laziness actually is to blame here. And that was a total failure.
Wow. What helped you get through that summer?
Well, friends and family and loved ones generally, right? Like, I think I have a support net, right? Like my family's super loving, got a wonderful sister. I'm married to a person who I've known since high school as well, and she's always been by my side in some way, even when she's living somewhere else. So like having that is a luxury, right? Like when it's all working together. And so that's what really like, I could easily have gone into like deeper despair about this stuff or thinking about things that were like crazy. But to be honest, I just always had that like positive envelope as well and a perspective of like, hey, it's going to be all right. That was really important. Yeah. And I just loved like books and jokes and music, and like the culture around me at any given time was really great. Houston was fantastic. Like living in Houston, we really hit like blues clubs all the time and just loved it, right? Like, and such a great music scene on that dimension there. I'm into hip hop a lot too, and Houston also had a really amazing hip hop scene. So you put these two things together, and I'm like, it wasn't like I was like in the middle of nowhere, right? It was just more that I looked in the mirror and I realized, you know what? You got to like figure out what you want to do, and not necessarily because you got to get paid and get a job. You got to find something that like motivates you to wake up every morning and love what you do, right? That was important to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I noticed something that you had mentioned on your LinkedIn about the time at Apple. And it was, I think it is a bold position to say, hey, I just didn't fit in that environment. What was your experience?
I think what I said something is like, humbled by its halls, but it's not the place for me. And at that time at Apple, it's like, look, I'm in a leadership role as for product across the app. This is like a dream come true. Like, especially when you rewind to the story I've told you before, it's like, I'm a fanboy of this situation. I really loved Apple products, right? Like, generally speaking, it's like I put that place on a pedestal. But, and people had warned me, and including Apple leadership, about like, hey, like we do things differently. We have very long horizons, right? Like, it's not about iteration and pace and all that as much, right? As much as like thoughtfulness and thinking the long haul. And sometimes you don't get it right and you may not fix it till later, right? And that's fine. The thoughtfulness that goes up front into design and the process of really thinking about that, I'll take with me for life. There's just so many people. But I was working on the apps, and the apps were very close to the apps I'd worked on before. So I'm used to YouTube. We were shipping every week, right? We're learning from data, that pace, that energy, balancing a few different things. It's a different cadence at Apple, right? It works for Apple. I'm not trying to say a judgment. And that's what I think is really important. But I would like to say that I like the pace and energy. And I think I like a little bit more of, thoughtful design up front to think about what problem you're solving, the job to be done, and what's necessary from an ecosystem to make that job fulfilling is very Apple-like. And I like that. But once you start moving, I like moving fast to fix and learn and iterate. And that muscle was something that I was super excited about. So when I think about joining Apple, I'm so glad I had the opportunity and got to meet some great friends there. And I think it's also like a slightly different era now than when I joined, right? There's people who've joined in machine learning and they're taking that seriously, and they're going to move into a leadership position there, and or at least put everything forward. But it was a little bit different at the time then. And some aspects of it is just be patient and it'll happen. But also remember, from my perspective, I think one of the key things for me, like I said, I don't know if it's a flaw or,
Bug or a feature.
a good feature, right? A bug or a feature, exactly, is that I wake up every day like looking forward to what that day's momentum will look like. And there can be lows and highs, and I'll still play it out. But I don't necessarily like the idea of like long-term horizons on things that I think we could do sooner.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Was it hard then, making that decision to move on, given the clout around your role, your position?
The way I look at these things is I like to leave before I've like set something in motion. And it's like, then I'm much more loyal to the people. So WeWork was an interesting analog, right? So the funny thing is, like, I remember how I said I wanted pace and maybe a little bit of chaos and energy. That's why WeWork was so tempting for me in many ways. It was also very similar to Apple. It's a hardware and a software business, right? It's basically physical space as well as software that could be detached from space, but is really tied to space. So I was really excited for that energy level. And I got it at WeWork. But WeWork was a little bit different too, because when I joined WeWork, day one's job was to start to recompose and rebuild the team, right? And bring in new capabilities so we can move on a more aggressive vision. Okay. So year one goes by and I'm like, I'm not sure. But I did stick around. And part of the reason for sticking around was the team that I'd built and my loyalty to them. And I'm not trying to come off as some saint. It's just that I talked to a lot of people in joining WeWork. And if I had just bounced, I would have felt a lot of regret around that. So I go through this journey at WeWork and there's a lot more loyalty around people. At Apple, is slightly different. In those, like I said, those 6 months, good team in place, right? A lot of the product managers that were on my team had joined Apple through acquisitions. And so they were there and they were working on things. And because of like the fact that a lot of that was in place, me leaving was really a question of me and whether, okay, do I want to make bets? Do I want to move forward? Do I feel comfortable in this environment? And do I feel like my own like sensibilities and style of working would work here? And maybe I could have adapted, but there wasn't also much damage about me leaving at that point. If I'd stayed there maybe a year or a year and a half, that would have been harder to do. So I think actually making the move sooner was the right thing for both of us. So I decided to leave. It's so hard to explain in some ways, right? Like the WeWork journey was the potential, and then the people, the team that was that we built was super exciting for me. Again, this concept of like having like software to run any space, to be able to load any space into that software and make it bookable, to just take that whole software solution and maybe even give it away for free because our upsell was space. Like that was an amazing opportunity. And so I really enjoyed that. And also as like team members came in, like particularly in technology, they were so excited about this potential. And that was cool. And then there were other aspects that were just super troublesome, which was the just radical notion of exploring every opportunity with a couple of days notice, right? There were a lot of issues with the company that, you know, obviously you can watch your fair share of movies now or read books or whatever it is. But a lot of that came down to the thrash that can happen. And so when you're balancing a good team playing a long game with that kind of organizational thrash that's going around you, that's a tough thing to balance out. Now, so you can either play one role, which is insulate and bear that, or, you know, occasionally just go along with it, pull some teams into exploring things or whatever it might be. And I don't think that, you know, I was ever comfortable navigating those decisions. And so I could wear the smile, you know, I could come into the office. I really enjoyed being on the West Coast. So I was a little bit insulated from the East Coast, but you never knew what any moment would bring. And a lot of those moments would be like thrashy things that you'd have to play whack-a-mole with versus sometimes, which are thrashy things, which are like, wow, we've got a complex option space. It's really fun to explore this, right? And so I felt like there's either like you could stay focused and move forward, but at any given day, there could be a sideways interrupt. And I really did not enjoy that. Here's another thing I fundamentally believe in, which is it's way better to start off focused and have that focus really define your future and really stay focused on it. It's been really interesting. Like, so, you know, I've joined Facebook right now, and I'll just give you a parallel story, which is like, you know, I'm focused on commerce. And a lot of what my role here has been is like set a strategy, narrow the aperture, like what's it going to take to win, and organize around those goals, which I fundamentally believe in. At WeWork, when I joined, it was actually a much broader canvas. Like for a period of time, I had internal systems and software building and some acquisitions and all this stuff together. And in hindsight, I think it would just been way better, right? And something I need to remember too, which I take forward all the time now, is like stay focused on the important thing, fall in love with that thing, and do it well, and then broaden out. And what's I think sometimes really hard, especially when you move into a C-level role, is remembering the importance that focus matters now. You are a representative of focus for the company, not just yourself. And so I think that's one of the key things for me. There's a lot of things that, you know, choices or maybe battles I should have fought or things to squash or things I shouldn't have gotten excited about because it just fell out of the aperture or the range of things that we could actually achieve in the next year. Because one thing I look at WeWork in those times is like, the way I look at it is just like fall in love with the core. The core is big. It's like, you know, you're opening up a building every week, right? You're getting that building to profitability and capacity. You get a sizable enough network, we can have on-demand usage of that space. That was the strategy. That's what excited me about it. And that's what I went there to do. And then it became a much broader thing. And instead of saying, no, someone else should deal with that, or no, we should not do it, I let myself own all of that. And in hindsight, what I regret about it is like, wow, the thing we were focused on itself in the most narrow lens was big enough and exciting enough that we all just could have like really, really played it out. And what's really nice to see is just like, we were back on track and not this crazy valuation or things like that, but it has a chance of growing on that same journey and you can pull the string and things that we thought about then and we're excited about them, like on-demand use of space is happening. So I'm actually really excited to see that. And it's exciting, from a perspective of being there when some of that stuff was originated.
Yeah, yeah. What did you personally feel like you learned or you realized after the
Well,
struggle?
there's one aspect of the culture that I think is really important, but sometimes it was impossible, which was just that you got to be able to debate and then make a decision and then let it stick. Okay. Not just revisit it. There's often frequent thing there where maybe one team would come together and say it's not a good idea now, but it would sprout again or someone else would take it on. And there's a lot of like issues with that because if you really cared about the company, you don't want these distractions going on. So it's really important to have a culture where you can debate and then move on, but stick by that decision. And that's something that I felt was lacking. And I was not comfortable with it. Like it would bring out aspects of me that were controlling or territorial because I just didn't want these sprouts coming up everywhere that I thought had either, poor judgment behind them or bad impact or they were distracting. So you get this, another thing comes out of you, which is like the protective kind of aspect of you of like, hey, let's make sure that this team is focused on it, they're getting it done, or they're not getting it done. But that doesn't mean someone else should just pick it up. And there's a lot of that aspect of it. I think that falls under the blanket, which is a little bit of a false like notion. Let's create a family of entrepreneurs who are doing all that stuff. And companies do want that entrepreneurial energy, that sense of ownership, et cetera. But that's not an excuse to violate, disagree, and commit. Like that's the problem. So that tension was very, very difficult for me to deal with. It brought out, again, this protective aspect, the shielding aspect, which also you don't want to have necessarily, right? And that can make you seem territorial, right? Or empire building or whatever it might be, when the reason you might be doing that is to protect things. So I think that was a big part of it. There's another aspect of it, which is I knew that these types of decisions and debates needed to happen in person in the culture of the executive team. But I was based in San Francisco and the rest of the team was in New York. So in order to have these discussions, you either fly out there to do it or you do it ineffectively. And that I knew before I joined. Again, I knew Adam long before I joined or a year before I joined. So I knew that was important and stylistically the way he operated. So I should have anticipated some of that, right? Because at the same time, occasionally you just have to okay, you got to jump on a flight and fly out to New York and get this done. But that's not a sustainable way to be a leader either.
Yeah, yeah. How did you feel about your team and kind of when everything was unraveling and sort of the team being in the middle of what we perceived as, we could sense that it was chaotic and we could see that you were doing everything that you can to protect us, kind of using your words, right? But still we could sense that it was a rocky ride.
Yeah, no, there was a point where, look, protection had to turn to transparency as well, right? Like the point of insulating teams from what they're doing so they can stay focused because it's not going to affect them. And then there was a point of where wow, this thing is really in a bad state. People need to start thinking of plan B. And so knowing the navigation and I'm sure you had some exposure to this too, but got to a point where it's look, a lot of this team is going to leave. So at that point, my principal focus went to landing people homes. That's really what it came down to. And that was actually incredibly fulfilling, I have to say. I remember this period of time. Remember, this is pre-COVID and a lot of stuff, right? It was just before that. And the world was like a candy land for jobs and opportunities. And, being able to help them either with introductions or background checks, it was pretty easy to do, but also was a chance to really help a lot of people land in good homes. So that from that perspective is actually really fulfilling. It's a weird thing, right? Let me try to reflect on this, 'cause I never thought of it this way, but to go and hire basically 500 to 700 people, and then to find homes for 500 to 700 people, all within a period of 2 years, is sort of crazy. So you're always on recruiting, and then all of a sudden you're always on helping people find the next thing. And to go through that in a compressed cycle with a group of people where we had like a year overlap, where we really loved and, had some accomplishments. And there's things I would have done differently for sure, knowing what I know. But that journey actually was super interesting.
That's why I want to double click, because it could not have been easy on you to say, now is time to let go.
Yeah, I think, what's interesting? There is a point, though, I'd say about a year and a half into the role, right, that I was sort of relieved by this. Okay. Because remember, we'd gone through a lot of stuff in that company. It just didn't have the right company operations about a lot of things, whether it, certain aspects or trying to figure out like, everything that you normally do in HR and stuff like that. Like it was bumpy at WeWork. And that's the case in many growth stage startups. That's not the case. But in this case, it was also like a question of like, do I want people, with these personalities and this quality to work in this environment? I don't know. Okay. Once you start to have that situation, imagine what that does to your recruiting, and imagine it does to everything. Now, it happened so suddenly and abruptly at the end. I didn't have to go through like, oh, and we're growing now. The next day we're laying people off, right? So very abrupt cycle, not that quick, but close enough. But it was also sort of relieving to know that a lot of people had made their bet on this organization, and it had not lived up to what they thought was important, either, principles or what the focus was or whatever it might be. And the fact that they were going to be able to find a new home was awesome. And luckily, we were not in a down economy at that point. So the opportunities were there. If the same thing had happened and just by a twist of fate, all of this happened, the first 3 months of COVID, completely different story. People stopped hiring. They weren't sure where to hire. A lot of different things were going on in that environment. The uncertainty was high. That would have been super unfortunate. But luckily, we missed that by 6 months.
Yeah, yeah. What is your regret?
I mean, again, my fundamental regret here, it just gets down to you got to evaluate the people, the product, and the purpose. And you got to look at all three. And if one of them doesn't check the box, probably not the right thing, right? For me, at least. Like I'm very sensitive to all three of them. And so from that perspective, I want to work with great people. And this isn't about everyone being like some monolithic culture. It's great people are people who you can debate and hug it out. Like there's no animosity after the fact. But more importantly, that you have that debate in very disciplined ways, right? I think that's important to me. Second thing is the product, which I really loved at WeWork. Like I said, it's like the stuff we were going to build and got built, and the on-demand stuff which we started. Like that's super exciting. So the product was there, and the purpose, when I joined, obviously was transcended space, and it had some flowery stuff to it. It got a lot more bigger and even more expensive in the next year and the year after that. So I don't want to say like that I wasn't attracted to the purpose, right? It's just that there's some aspect of practicality around it that I think is also now important to me in hindsight. So I think, but my regrets ultimately are, I know this is weird to say too. It's like, I don't regret one aspect of this, which is building the team and getting to know those people. Because again, I just love people. And so there's that aspect of it. And the team, like there's still people who email me every day. We're doing this thing, right? Like it's just such a treasure trove of great souls. And I love that. But would I do this whole thing again? I don't know, because like I do feel like I compromise things, that for me were super, super important, and therefore created a lot of sleepless nights. And so it's like what everyone says. Would I do year one again? Probably. Okay. Because got to build a team and you're going up. Would I do year two again? Probably not. So that's how I land.
What would you do different?
Remember that scope thing? I would narrow the scope. I would stay focused on one thing. I would do it well. I would make harsher decisions about how many teams are moving in parallel to get something done. I would have basically, moved much more urgently around the things that we agreed are possible. Could I have gotten away with that? I don't know. In hindsight, I definitely could have. Could I have pushed harder for that when I was there? Yes, absolutely. Would I have been successful, like actually getting things off the plate and removing distractions? I'm not sure. But I certainly would have, gone into this with much more focus in mind, which is how I approach like my life now.
I know we talked a lot about the Shiva at work. We didn't talk about Shiva at home. What is your personal life? What were some of your most difficult decisions that you make or made?
The things that sometimes personally that I have regret about is just that when you've moved from place to place, etc., and moved from company to company, have you had time to work on yourself and create your own rituals? Because like when you're onboarding into a company, it can take over your life. You do that 6 times over a period of 9 years, right? Like that's pretty hard. That's where like I probably let work take over my personal life in a way that is imbalanced. Now I've found ways to correct that balance. Oh, and like a beautiful thing about COVID is realizing how beautiful life is when you don't have the hour and a half commute every day. Like it is life changing for me to have those literally 3 hours back every day is just amazing. I get to do exercise and do stuff like this, and I can really reflect on myself and have downtime unexpectedly. And I love working from home, right? Like you can take a walk in the middle of the day and just things like that that I would not habitually done before. So if you ask me, my biggest regret in my personal life is that I love my personal life. I love my friends and I love what we do together. And I love my wife and we just have like a great life, but I've let work intrude on it a little bit too much over the past 10 years.
Wise words.
So that's why I'm just really, I don't want the working world to go back exactly where it was, right? Like I think that would be a mistake. I hate seeing Bay Area traffic start to get up to normal again, I mean, just little things like this. And so I just hope we get into this balance. Now, I'm also just honest too, is like working at home is a luxury for a lot of people. So I totally get that. But I hope people can pick what's best for them in the future versus having one template forced on them. And I realize for me, that's particularly important learning, which is that I'm actually a better leader and person now, thanks to being forced to manage my time and space and consciously like be at home a lot more. Put that all together, it's brought out the best in me. And so I got to remember that too, because it's also going to be really easy. Like I said, I wake up every day as though there's no history. And so my biggest fear is like just going right back into the routines that were forced upon me before and I just did not push back on. That is important for me to preserve as I go forward.
My biggest fear. Yeah, that's interesting use of words. And you're right. I mean, we would default to the older pre-COVID way of living pretty quickly if we don't remind ourselves of the new habits that we are forming during these moments of deep thinking, right?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a great hubris in people who are very adaptable. And I put myself into that situation. Is we can adapt to a situation so much so, right, chameleon-like, that we don't realize what that's doing to our leadership ability or our happiness or the people around us. And so we can acclimate in a lot of ways. And I think it's a skill a lot of immigrants have, particularly successful ones, is that they've acclimated fully, right? So I've just been very good at acclimating to different solutions to the point that I bullshit myself that I'm actually happy and successful. And if you want to talk about failure, I think that is maybe the thing that I've realized over this past year is like, it's not a skill if you compromise what you believe in and or compromise your efficacy.
Well, thanks for the time, Shiva. This was an interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing stories of your struggles through leadership roles. What are some of the considerations that you had looking at the team that you were building? Being honest about, being open and candid about the fears that you have and the regrets. So I really appreciate the time.
Super. Yeah, no, my pleasure. It was really good connecting. Thanks for doing this. I hope it has, all of these kinds of, like, celebrating the failure, I think is really important. And you're right, it's not been enough. But the flip side is like, it's also just nice to, it's cathartic to reflect on it. I appreciate that.
And that's how the cookie crumbles. Talking to Shiva helped me understand that failure is all in a perspective. The ones where we anticipated failures and yet made those choices are the hardest ones to reckon with. But those are the important ones to come to terms with and make peace with it. It also made me understand that when it comes to career moves, having a perspective on people, product, and purpose are all critical. When two of these three feel out of place, one should have the courage to take the right next step, whether it is to course correct, at place, or move on. I also realized that every transition is time consuming and energy consuming. So it is important to recognize the ripple effects of changing jobs, of changing roles, and making accommodations in lifestyle to absorb the ripple effects. Maybe even giving oneself the time to absorb it, right? Thank you for listening to this episode. Do share your thoughts and feedback. I am on Twitter @FarmNectar. Until the next conversation. Cheers, everyone.